Vacation working. I'm good. Man, a tech support nightmare, but that's it. All right, today I want to talk about the Glorious Revolution. Again, I apologize. Let's for the people who couldn't make it. This will be recorded and will be available on YouTube. The Glorious Revolution, as it's called in this period, is also the financial revolution. I want to help us understand the financial revolution in Britain. This is not discussed at all in the textbook. This is perhaps one of the most important things, I would argue, in terms of explaining why the British defeat France and Spain in the control of the New World. And it's just not mentioned at all in the textbook. And this is a crucial distinction, I think, between my take and the rest of the takes. And this will be important for understanding the conflict between Hamilton and Jefferson. It'll be important for to understand the coming of the Civil War. This financial revolution that happens in Britain is really crucial, I think, to understanding why colonization is successful, why settler colonialism is successful. Okay, so let's start with Britain. So the question today that I want to ask is, what allows the British to defeat the Spanish and the French in North America in the 1700s? And the answer to that in the book is population increase, settler colonialism, few reliance on Native Americans than the French. My answer is, okay, yeah, that's important, but also don't forget the English financial revolution. Don't forget money, because money, I think, is an important part of this. Money and slavery and all these things are linked together. Okay, to start with, England has two revolutions within 40 years. All right, the first revolution we talked about already. That's the revolution pictured up here on the right. That's the English Civil War, in which Charles I loses his head in that kind of grim image there. And I have lost the chat. Oh, can I repeat what the book says about this? All right. Oh, right, and my face has covered it up. Okay. All right, let me try to do this properly. This day, could it be any worse? Yes, it could be worse, I think. Okay, much better. All right, there we are. So, what allows the British to defeat the French and the Spanish in North America? That's what this lecture is going to be about today in the 18th and the 1700s. The textbook. It could be worse. It could be worse. I could be having a heart attack or, I don't know, God forbid, a whole bunch of other things. You guys could not be doing well. I hope you all are doing well. Okay, so the textbook says population increase, British population increase, settler colonialism. Yeah, sorry. And less reliance on Native Americans than the French. Okay, that's basically what the textbook says. Okay, I promise I won't have a heart attack. I'm taking pills, so I'm good. Okay, my argument is, okay, but don't forget the English financial revolution. And what I'm going to talk about is debt-financed expansion, the new power of the financial elite in the bank. The financial elite uses this English credit marker to lend to farmers and enslavers who push far into the backcountry. Okay, that's the takeaway for this lecture, and I'm going to explain all that in the next few minutes. Okay, so some background. England had two revolutions within 40 years. First is Charles I. Charles I refuses to call Parliament. He prorogues the Parliament. That is, he basically tells the Parliament that they don't have the right to work. Prorogues the Parliament. That's how you spell it. Basically, Parliament pushes back. They take over. They declare England a Commonwealth. They cut off Charles I's head. And they have no spicy food. That's the final piece of the reason why British food is so nasty is in part because of the English Civil War, because the English Civil War basically is the Puritans who are trying to purify the Bible purify the Anglican traditions. They resent the power of the king. They push back against the king. They cut off his head, and basically they argue that spicy food causes bastardy. It causes sexual passion, which needs to be, which then leads to adultery. And believe it or not, so this is the Puritans believed that spicy food is a terrible thing. Okay, but most importantly and more seriously, they cut off Charles I's head. We have the English Civil War. We have three countries fighting each other in this period, and then Charles II comes back to the throne. Charles II is a pretty terrible king. He's a child of Charles I. You can see in this little map here, the little genealogy there. And Charles II has 13 mistresses. He eats a lot of spicy food. He's a pretty terrible king. He's replaced by his brother, James II. And James II, though, has converted to Catholicism in 1670. James II is a Catholic king. James II is a terrible king and leads to, there's all this chaos in Britain in this period. And Parliament in 1688 brings about another revolution in which they ask the Dutch prince and his wife Mary to invade Britain and take over. And that's called the Glorious Revolution. So just a little bit, if you're keeping track of the monarchy, which I would generally not agree with, but you're keeping track of the monarchy, Charles I dies. His son Charles II replaces him. Charles II, the one with the mistresses, he's in power for a little while. He's replaced by his brother James. The Parliament axes James and then asks Mary, who is James II and Charles II's sister, and her husband William to come to the throne. William is a prince in the Netherlands. Okay? And that's the so-called Glorious Revolution. It's a pretty bloodless revolution. It's a Dutch invasion of 1688. William and Mary come from the Netherlands. They land in Brixham and they travel by land to Westminster, where they take the crown. Okay? And so it's a bloodless revolution, or pretty bloodless revolution, the Glorious Revolution. And what's important about this is that this new king now, William and Mary, have a very different relationship to the throne, okay? They don't have absolute power in the way that Charles I did. They can't tell people what to do. They solemnly promise in their oath to swear to govern the people of this kingdom of England and the dominions thereunto according to statutes in Parliament agreed on. And the laws and customs are the same. In other words, this is constitutional monarchy. This is a new kind of monarchy that where the crown does not have absolute authority. This is really important because it's a different kind of kingship in Britain than the rest of Europe. The important part about this is not that it's better or worse than absolute monarchy. The important part about this is that when Parliament gets itself involved in governing in a way that's the French Parliament, the Spanish Parliament, the Prussian Parliament don't, we see a new kind of financial revolution take place. This comes, in fact, from William himself, who's Dutch. He's seen how the Dutch institutions function, and he creates these things called exchequer bills. It's the first English national bonds. They're based on Dutch bonds. Okay? These bonds allow Britain to expand exponentially. Remember before I talked about the revenge of the Hanseatic League? The Hanseatic League that uses bonds? Well, Britain, starting with the Glorious Revolution, is now issuing debt, okay, over the long term. And here you see this is an exchequer bond here on the right, exchequer bill here on the right. It basically, you lend to Britain, and they pay you back over a period of years, and they take that money from taxes to pay you back. Okay. This is this is um, this is a very different system than the king just having capital or Parliament having capital. This long-term debt financing that allows Britain to basically defeat its rivals in Europe. Basically, it can borrow, it can leverage that money, it can take capital and use it, borrow it, and then use it to defeat its rivals. Also, lottery tickets. For those of you that are Hope Scholars, that have the Hope Scholarship, you might know a little bit about lottery tickets. Oh, no, the Exchequer bills were by the federal government, by the British government. And no, the people who bought those bonds were people who wanted to get, say, had £10,000 and wanted to get a yearly payment over a period of 10 or 15 years. If you wanted that payment with interest and with considerable interest, you'd get it by buying these exchequer bills, and then basically the British government would pay you off over a period of 10 years. Britain also issued lottery tickets, which it used basically to pay its immediate debts. And those of you that are Hope Scholars know the lottery tickets, or maybe I hope you know, the lottery tickets are what pay for your scholarships here at UGA. Yeah, yeah, lottery tickets were gambling in this period, and they're very, very popular. Why would someone buy a bond? Okay, let's say you're a wealthy British landowner, okay, and you have a daughter and a son, and you want to make sure that they are set up for the next 20 years or so, because they're the people who are going to inherit everything that you own. So for your son, you might give your son the land that you own. But for your daughter, you might buy some exchequer bills, which then pays her, say, £150 or £200 a year for the space of 20 or 30 years. This method of basically investing in the government, in the British government, is how an exchequer bill works. Yeah, and lottery tickets help to pay the immediate debt. Okay, sorry. So basically, what Britain is doing is borrowing money to pay its debts. It's also issuing lottery tickets to pay its debts. The lottery tickets are a relatively small portion of this, but the exchequer bills are the most important things. And the people who are buying these exchequer bills are any person who has capital who wants to get that money paid off with interest over, say, 10 years or 20 years or 30 years. Yeah, it's like having a savings account. Although instead of paying 2%, which is what you get from a savings account now, this exchequer bill pays 8% or 9%. Yeah, very good interest, right? It's like having a savings account, but with like 9% interest. Okay? So a good interest rate. Does that make sense? So the people who are funding Britain as a state over the long term are all these people like Mr. and Mrs. Roberts that we talked about last class. People who are very wealthy people who basically hold these exchequer bills and get paid off by taxes over time. What does that mean? That means that Britain can borrow money in large amounts to prosecute wars against France and Spain. William creates the Bank of England. The Bank of England is chartered in 1694 using Dutch principles. The Bank of England has no connection to the crown. Its connection is to basically a series of very wealthy merchants who effectively hold and then reissue those exchequer bills for the British government. They are the people who kind of are connected with the issuing of these bonds. They're also effectively borrowing from other wealthy individuals and paying them off over time. They're the people who issue the currency of the British banks in this period. So the Bank of England is a lender of the last resort. It lends to everyone else. And it's an independent entity, okay? And this is back to William and Mary. their relationship to Britain now is one in which they depend on the laws of Parliament for their control, for their ownership, for their kingship, the king and queenship, right? Okay, so this means that British national debt soars from 1690 to 1790. Sorry, cut off there. Okay, so using exchequer bills and consols, which are basically bonds, the British national debt soars because it can borrow all this money and fight the 9 Years' War, fight the War of Spanish Succession, fight the War of Austrian Succession, fight the 7 Years' War, and eventually fight a war against the United States in the American Revolution. This is the debt, and this debt makes it possible to put hundreds of British Navy ships at sea. It allows the state to expand dramatically. It allows the state to build roads through many regions in Europe. Okay. So the British after 1688, after the Glorious Revolution and this financial revolution, are rich and heavily taxed. Does that make sense? I'm sorry if I'm going fast here. I felt like I lost a couple minutes there. This debt is first paid by a land tax, or primarily by a land tax, and then after 1715, mostly by excise taxes, which are stamp taxes. These are taxes on things like cider, beer, hops, candles, leather, tea. I was going to show you if you bought liquor outside of Georgia, in most states, when you buy liquor, you know it's got that paper seal on the outside of it. Maybe some of you haven't bought liquor recently, but in most states outside of Georgia, you've got that paper seal. That's a great question. Okay, if there's so much debt, how is this a financial revolution? Basically, it's every other European state has to either borrow from bankers or depend on its yearly income. What the Britain can do in the financial revolution is borrow against future income. Borrow against income that's coming 10 years, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 years in the future from taxes. It can borrow that money and then build a much larger army, a much larger navy than its competitors. Previously, kings had to go to, they had their own wealth, but it was considerable. It was in the tens of thousands of pounds or something like that. What Britain can do is borrow hundreds of thousands of pounds against its future earnings. Now, the Glorious Revolution is what happens in 1688, but historians have said that that connected with this and the growth of this infrastructure right around the same time, about 1690 or so, is the financial revolution in Britain. Okay, so the Glorious Revolution was a term people used in 1688. Historians refer to this as a financial revolution as well. Right? Yes, sorry about that. Okay. All right, so this debt is paid by land taxes and then increasingly by taxes on beer and liquor and stuff like that. And if you buy rum or other goods if you go to the 5 Points bottle shop and you buy liquor, some portion of that the liquor that you're going to buy goes to the federal government. It's something like a 2% or 1%. So when you buy rum or any other expensive spirit, there's a percentage of it that goes back to the federal government. That's a federal excise tax. They had debt because they had, so previously kings did borrow from other monarchs and they borrowed occasionally from goldsmiths and things like that, but they had to pay a very high interest rate, something like 12 to 15%. Sometimes they had those people executed if they couldn't pay them back. A lot of controversy and difficult to raise money. This whole infrastructure with the Bank of England, with the exchequer bills, and these other goods allow Britain to borrow much, much more money based on future income. And this is British borrowing. This is British debt. This goes from 1690, from in millions of pounds goes from basically 1 million pounds to, by 1770, 130 million pounds. Okay? That's debt. That's debt that Britain has assumed over time to prosecute its wars primarily. We used to think, we ordinarily think of debt as being a weakness, right? But for Britain, which has, and the British Crown, which has relatively little capital at the time, it's, the British Crown is wealthy, but it can borrow tens of millions of pounds more than it has, provided it agrees with Parliament about how those taxes are going to be allocated. They borrowed money from their own people, basically from bankers all over the world. People all over the world, but particularly in Germany and Switzerland and France, would buy these exchequer bills knowing that Britain would pay them off over time. They included the Dutch, but it could be from anywhere. Okay, so Britain is engaged in a series of wars then. The 9 Years' War, the War of Spanish Succession, the War of Austrian Succession, the 7 Years' War, each of them expanding Britain's power over these other regions. And so when we talk about it took in some cases 40, 50, 100 years for other European nations to develop this. Russia did it in 1770. France did it after the French Revolution. So basically it creates a kind of formal structure for borrowing really after the French Revolution in 1789. So Britain is the early adopter of this debt-financed, bank-connected system of borrowing and lending. Why does debt go down? What basically the debt goes down after the wars, basically as they're paid off over time by kind of increase. It surges during the wars, and right. All right. Okay. Yeah. I'm sorry about this subscribing thing. I'm going to try not to pay attention to this, but this was something that was instituted. I don't make any money from this feed. I promise. Okay. All right, who benefits from this? Well, among the people who benefit are the American colonists, particularly those colonists connected to trade. American merchants benefit from this financial revolution because they're provisioning these English ships, which are the key military instruments of Britain, provisioning English ships at war, providing wheat, lumber, turpentine, and rum. Remember, rum is the worth the wheat, lumber, turpentine, and rum are all things that basically the American colonies are providing. And so look, this is what wheat prices look like over the period of the English financial revolution from 1700 to 1780. Population surges, but wheat prices also surge because because these American colonies are providing wheat for what are called victualling yards. Where's my cursor? Victualling yards, which are basically things that are providing victuals or food to the British Navy. Okay, so we saw in the textbook the commercial revolution. That is as more and more people surge into the colonies between 1700 and 1790. There's a surge in English imports. Okay. Another part of the financial revolution is Scottish merchants who increasingly make use of the Bank of England to provide goods on credit at high rates for Virginia farmers and planters. So The British government gets credit using the Bank of England and is able to issue exchequer bills, which are issued by the Bank of England. But it's also able to, the Bank of England also funds Scottish merchants who land in Virginia, for example, establish big factories here for the packaging of goods. This is in Scotland. Transport them to the New World, and then sell them on credit to farmers. So farmers are able to buy in these stores, and this is a new word, stores in this period. And the goods that they're providing are things that allow you to survive over the winter, right? Things like cheese and other goods, baskets, plow points, other steel goods, but also linen, which is coming from Britain cheaply. Also porcelain, also forks and knives, cutlery and things like that. All these things are provided. You buy them on credit at a store. You go into the store, you introduce yourself to the merchant who runs the store. The merchant will likely know, because they're in the community, how many acres of land you have, and they will offer you goods on credit. And then when your tobacco comes in at the end of the year, you'll pay that merchant off. The effective credit rate is something like 15 to 20 to 25%. But it means that you can have goods and settle in the West. It means that you pay a very, very high interest rate. Yeah, they're basically the same thing. The financial revolution comes slightly after the Glorious Revolution. And the Glorious Revolution is a term to describe the emergence of William and Mary. A financial revolution is a general and more broad thing, which is really about the creation of the Bank of England, 1694, so a few years later, and the creation of exchequer bills, which is 1689, 1690, so it's right around the same time. Okay? I'm sorry if I'm confusing you, but the financial revolution starts basically with the reign of William. William inaugurates what we call the financial revolution. Oh, so the things you can buy from the Scottish merchants are basically. This is the colonial. This is a colonial Williamsburg store, just to give you a sense of what's here. It's got drums and bags and things like that. This is actually not. It's got soap, which is very expensive to make. It's got tea, which is something that is coming all the way from China, but is brought by British boats. It's bringing the other goods that are discussed in Chapter 5 that a lot of American colonists are using. Yeah, cheese, steel goods, linen, baskets, porcelain, and cutlery. All of these things are things that are provided by these stores. Yeah, they did get business with that, because remember before this financial revolution, before say 1690, if you were in Virginia, the way you got goods was you went to a large planter, a planter who collected some of these things. You paid him an interest rate of 40 or 45% for those goods. And so these Scottish merchants are in charging 25%, are actually giving you a better deal than the very large planters who got some extra goods and then would sell them to you at very high prices and very high interest rate. Does that make sense? Yeah, but they did and if you think about this, it's crucial that you have these goods. You cannot expand in the West unless you have things like plow points and forks and knives and steel goods, cloth, also thread and needles. All of these things that seem that are so you get from Amazon now are things you absolutely needed if you were going to settle in the backcountry. You absolutely needed them, and this is what allows English settlers to basically expand into the West. Okay. So that's the store. So this is the financial revolution. So what allows the British to defeat the French and the Spanish in North America? Scottish Walmart, exactly. I don't know if Sam Walton was Scottish or not, but there you are. The textbook says population increase, settler colonialism, and less reliance on Native Americans than the French. I would argue that behind that, all of that, is this new debt financed expansion, right? Which comes with the financial revolution, comes with the reign, begins in the reign of William and Mary. It puts a new power, it creates new power for a financial elite in the Bank of England. And this financial elite uses the English credit market to lend to farmers and enslavers who push into the backcountry. It depends on excise taxes, right? So this British, the British state is borrowing, and then it's going to pay off that debt with excise taxes, and that's ultimately going to be its downfall because British American sort of folks who come from the Americas are going to reject increasingly the very high taxes that are imposed to keep the British state afloat. Okay? All right. I promised that when I do a transition, I would put another break in here, and so I want to talk about. So I've talked about this financial revolution, sort of what it is, which is basically debt financing, and what it does, which is allow both the British state to expand and also merchants to expand by gives them credit, which they then, in the case of British merchants, Scottish merchants, gives them credit, which they then provide to colonists. Okay, now I want to talk about the grim balance sheet of the financial revolution. I want to talk about Palatine, Jacobite, and African migrants. Okay, because as this powerful British state begins to mobilize and it begins to move more and more people across the Atlantic, this is going to be a peculiar transition. I may not finish all of this because I started about 10 minutes late. That's Palpatine. Sorry about that. Yeah, no, that's Palpatine. Palatine is it's not related. Palatine is it's actually a Latin word. Paladin. You know, paladin is the the medieval warriors. It's a Latin word for a palatine, which was so it's related to hill. It's basically these used to be part of the Roman Empire. This area in Germany, and I'll just show you where the Palatinate is because it's confusing. So this is Germany, right? And where is the? So this is the Rhine River. That dotted river is the Rhine River. Okay, that dotted line. This is, in fact, the dark side of the financial revolution. Okay, that's an excellent point. This is the Palpatine side of the revolution. Okay, so Palatine migration first. Let me talk a little bit about the Palatinate. So people will talk about Germans in the 1700 until the 1750s. They often called them Palatines because they came from this region that was part of the Roman Empire that's along the Rhine River, mostly here in Pfalz and Hessen-Darmstadt. Okay, so there's a series of wars in which France tries to expand into this region. Britain and all the other Allied countries fight back against French expansion. But what the French do is basically when they move into these regions, they burn the cities. All right, they destroy the cities, rape and pillage and do all these horrible things. And this produces these refugees, these German refugees, or German-speaking refugees they think of themselves as German at this point. And they're called the Palatines. And they are the people who are kind of expelled from this region by France's attempt to expand across the Rhine and take both sides of the Rhine here in the 1690s, 1700s, in the same period as the Palatinate. England is an empire. France is an empire. England and the Netherlands are fighting back against France, which is trying to expand. Okay, so the Palatines, the Germans, are refugees. And so these people are the people that expand into the New World. So when we think about, let me just show you this. Okay, so this is arrivals in the port of Philadelphia between 1700 and 1800 in the period of the Financial Revolution. And you'll see here the red is the German migration. Okay, so many more of the people who are coming to the New World from in the period of the English Financial Revolution, many more of the European migrants are German migrants. Okay, and it's this that leads Benjamin Franklin in the chapter to complain about all these German migrants, right? But there are lots and lots of German migrants. So this, is in a way, is the kind of the if there's a dark side to the Financial Revolution, this is maybe the less dark side. In that all of these palatines are displaced by the French Empire. They're refugees, or financial refugees. They're this, and basically Queen Anne in 1709 says, we will allow you to settle in the New World and establish farms in those regions. They're from the Rhine, basically in what we now call Germany, on both sides of the Rhine River, which is called the Palatine region, which is why they're called the Palatines. Does that make sense? Sorry if it's a little confused. This is, Germany is massive here, like what we think about Germany now. But this is the Palatine folks who are coming from this area, this mostly German-speaking region on this end of this area in the Rhine in Europe. Sorry, it's a little confusing. This is the North Sea. This is the Baltic Sea. This is France over here. It's not a beautiful map, but it's along the Rhine River. Okay, and it's this that Franklin objects to. He says, these people are boors. He called. I don't know if I have the. Oh, here we are. Here's the quote. Why should the Palatine boors be suffered to swarm into our settlements, and by herding together establish their languages and manners to the exclusion of ours? Why should Pennsylvania, founded by the English, become a colony of aliens who will shortly be so numerous as to Germanize us instead of our Anglifying them, and will never adopt our language or customs any more than they can acquire our complexion? I don't know what complexion Benjamin Franklin had that, right? So this is Benjamin Franklin. And if you're at UGA, you're likely to come from Franklin College. This is Franklin's legacy. Okay, so this is Benjamin Franklin. And sometimes they were called the Pennsylvania Dutch, but they were mostly in this period called Palatines. Okay, so the point of this is just to suggest that this anxiety about immigrants goes all the way back to before there was the United States. This anxiety about immigrants coming to this cosmopolitan place, the Americas, goes well back before the Revolution. And Franklin's words are used against him later. He later sort of accepts that the Palatines are not as horrible as he thought in the 1750s. But the fact is that there is a massive migration, and in terms of immigrants, these German-speaking folks outnumber English-speaking folks in the area around in Philadelphia in the 1740s. Now, these people come over as servants. Okay, these people come over by and large. They have to pay their passage, and these people are called German redemptioners. Okay, so they pay their passage. It takes about 5 or 10 years, and maybe this is the somewhat darker side to this Palatine. When we're back to dark side and light side, this Financial Revolution, they're paid for, but their debt is to basically pay off in a space of 5 to 7 years, 3 to 7 years. Their passage. And so there would be advertisements in the newspapers for these German redemptioners, laborers, farmers, blacksmiths, bakers. you come to the port in Baltimore or Philadelphia, and you offered money for their payment, and then you demanded years of service from these people. And these are the German redemptioners. So these are people basically buying their way to the New World. They don't have the capital and paying it off with labor. Now, this is not slavery, but it is indentured servitude. It's 3 to 5 to 7 years. And as I said before, most of the people that come to the New World from Europe, most of the people who come to the New World are either enslaved or indentured servants for some period of the time that they're here. Okay. So that's the German Palatine migration. They come as redemptioners and they pay off their passage over time when they arrive at the docks. And they're basically, their labor is sold by other people. Now that said, I said that there are more Germans than others that arrive in this region, more Palatines than English settlers between 1700 and 1800. But these people are vastly outnumbered by the African slave trade, and we talked about the African slave trade before. But there are many Africans who come over, and this is one of my points about why New England doesn't matter as much as we think it does. The reason we think that New England is so much in the textbooks, in U.S. history textbooks now, it's less and less important, is because all the Ivy League schools were in New England. So that's why there are more books about Puritans than there were Puritans now, is because the New England schools, the Ivy League schools, everybody who are academics got their money. Basically, all these documents, they obsess about New England as being the definition of America. Germans came over because something got lost here. Okay. Yeah, it's not exactly like this. It's basically that Britain is able to put more ships on the ocean than France can through this financial revolution. Merchants are able to put more ships. English merchants are able to put more ships on the ocean because of this powerful institution called the Bank of England, which is independent from the crown and is lending both to the British state and to merchants. Does that make sense? So the Germans come over because they're basically refugees. They're basically driven out of their cities by the French, and they have nowhere to settle. And it's the British, which have lots and lots of ships plying in this triangular trade, that make it possible for German folks to buy basically sell their labor for 3 to 5 years and then settle in the New World. Does that make sense? So they experience it as a financial revolution in the fact that these ships are able to have the credit that allows them to bring people over, but they demand payment when the Germans arrive, and that payment is paid by the person who buys that person's labor for 3 to 5 years. Does that make sense? Okay, so what is North America providing in the support of this British expansion? The expansion of this British Empire is providing all these goods: tar, pitch, grease, pork, beef, rum, and flour. All these colonial stores, as they're called, are things that are vital to the expansion of the British Empire. I'm trying to put the empire back into this story because it's helpful to understand this empire, and it's helpful to understand the role of debt, because debt is going to be something that all the parties are going to be based on for the rest of American history up until 1877. Conflicts over debt and the power of state institutions like the Bank of England, like the Bank of North America, like the Bank of the United States, are going to be the crucial things that divide Americans even after the Revolution. Okay, so that is the German redemptioners. But one of the things to point out is that these German redemptioners are outnumbered by enslaved Africans that are brought over. Southern migrants, enslaved, indentured, and free, outnumbered New England and Middle States migrants in the 1700s. It's the South that's most important. And why? Because the South is providing the drugs that Europeans need. The South is providing the goods that Europeans are craving, including coffee, chocolate, tobacco, sugar. All of these things are being provided in the Americas, partly by the Caribbean and partly by southern colonies. And these southern colonies have this advantage. Okay, that's the Palatine migration. Now I want to talk a little bit about the Jacobite migration. Bear with me here while I try to find my Jacobites. Okay. Give me a sec to... Okay. Let me talk a little bit about the Jacobites. Jacobites are here in northern, in Scotland. Okay. Okay. The largest migration from the British Isles to the New World in the 18th century were the Scots-Irish. Their numbers were only greater among enslaved people. Initially, Presbyterian Scots were shipped into Ulster, which is the northern part of Ireland. They were sent by James I in 1603 from Scotland here to Northern Ireland. And the plan was, according to James I, was to civilize Ireland, which was this Catholic region. And Britain sends English, French, and German Protestants to Ulster, but mostly Scottish Presbyterians to Ulster. Northern Ireland is physically closest to England. James had already displaced the Irish Catholic earls who had gone to Spain and Rome for help in fighting the English crown. So the landowners, the very large, wealthy landowners of the Irish Catholic earls, had been expelled, and they're replaced by these Presbyterian Scots. The Scots lived there about a century before moving over to the American colonies. 10 years after William and Mary come to the throne, the English crown limits the Scottish Presbyterians' rights to hold office. Also, children are barred from Irish and English universities unless they accept the sacrament from the Anglican Church. The government tries to limit presbyteries to choose their own ministers. So what we have is Scottish people who've settled in Ireland, right, between 1600 and 1700, or 1603 and 1690 or so. And those people are then deprived of their rights by the British Crown. The presbyteries are their own form of worship and to a certain extent their own form of government that the Scottish have in Ireland. Now, the Scottish Presbyterians shortly afterwards fought to return James II to the throne. They tried to bring James II back to the throne. These were the so-called Jacobite risings. They were both rebellions against the British, and they were attempts to reverse the Glorious Revolution, attempts to turn back the power of William and Mary to bring James II to the throne. These Ulster Scots regard England as a nation that has betrayed Scots by promising them one thing and doing another. The people who deprive them of their rights are the English. So the English are depriving the Scots of their rights in Ireland. This is very confusing. But basically, if you're Scottish and you're in a Presbyterian church, you can't go to Oxford or Cambridge to be educated unless you adopt the Anglican Church. And so there's a Jacobite rising where you have these Scots-Irish who are fighting the British. These Ulster Scots called themselves frontier inhabitants, and they despised the term Scots-Irish, which I've been using for the last 5 minutes, because they disliked the connection to Irish Catholics. They called themselves Ulster Scots in England and Ireland. Scots despised the Irish for being lazy and heavy drinkers, they said. The English and the Germans despised the Scots for the same reason, and they saw them as hot-tempered and violent, saw them as tainted by Irish habits, saw them as rough, who drank too much, and they weren't as thrifty or as good farmers as the Scots who were still in Scotland. The English and German also thought the Scots were obsessed with their own freedom and viewed those threats to their freedom everywhere. They called themselves Northern Dissenters. In England, they weren't in the Church of England and so had few political or religious rights in the British Isles. They could not participate in official government institutions. This is, in a way, an answer to Emily's question. They couldn't participate in official government institutions. They couldn't run for office unless they abandoned their church and joined the Anglican Church. They tended to rent the arable land. They bypassed eastern towns to settle on the frontier beyond the reach of the law and polite society. Okay, how do these people end up in America? Why do these Scots-Irish end up in America? Well, after the English financial revolution, again, around 1690, more and more ships are coming and going to India. And cheap, high-grade Indian cotton goods from the British East India Company start arriving in the 1720s. And these Indian cotton goods are cheaper, lighter, and have better looking prints than linen. The primary export of Northern Ireland is linen. These stockherders or weavers of flax from the colonies had been producing linen for the British goods, but these Indian goods coming all the way from India are cheaper, and they gain a huge interest in the upper classes. And so the upper classes in Britain stop using linen that's coming from Northern Ireland, and they start buying cotton that's coming from India. There's a serious downturn in Scotland because of the arrival of the Indian cotton, and it's in 1726 and to 28. There's depression in Scotland. In Ireland, Northern Ireland, where the Scots are. It's in this period that Jonathan Swift publishes what he calls a modest proposal to take care of Ireland's harvest failures. He says, "I've been assured by a very knowing American of my acquaintance in London that a young, healthy child, well nursed, is at a year old a most delicious, nourishing, and wholesome food, whether stewed, roasted, baked, or boiled." Jonathan Swift makes the case for trying to boil these Scotch-Irish babies and eat them, calling attention to the plight of the Scots-Irish. To keep up with cheap Indian cotton, lots of flax is imported. Flax is the thing that's used to make linen, is imported from the American colonies, including Newcastle, Delaware, and Philadelphia. Right? So basically what we're talking about, I'm trying to give you a sense of all the refugees. So the palatines are the refugees from this war. The refugees from this financial revolution in Ireland, in Northern Ireland, are the Scottish, who face this economic downturn from the competition of these new goods in the British Empire. Lots of raw flax is imported from the Delaware ports, Philadelphia and Newcastle, Delaware, and Philadelphia. They go to factories in Ulster where they're turned into linen, and shipment of people back becomes a secondary activity. And there are mostly empty ships going from Northern Ireland to Philadelphia in the 1730s and 40s. This makes it very cheap to travel from Northern Ireland to the United States. Passage in the 1720s is less than 7 pounds. It used to be 80 or 100 pounds in the around 1700. It's only 7 pounds to go from Northern Ireland to Philadelphia or Newcastle in 1720, 1725, say, or 1726, in the period of this downturn in Scotland. Again, Ireland, Northern Ireland. Many of these people come over as indentured servants also. though many more come over as prisoners after the uprisings in 1740s, this Jacobite uprising. So this is another reason why the Scots-Irish arrive in the Americas. They're passed on from 1688 to the 1750s. Over 70% of all the Europeans to the New World came over as indentured servants. But the effect of the financial revolution and the consolidation of the English monarchy meant that newcomers increasingly come from other parts of the United Kingdom, Ireland especially. These people resettled in the hills. they came over not for linen, but as backwash from linen, right? So the raw flax is coming over. This is really important to understand. When we want to understand human migration, we need to understand that ships can't go back empty, right? So the ships are taking this raw flax from Newcastle, Delaware to Northern Ireland, and they're going back empty. That makes it super cheap to go back from Northern Ireland to the New World, particularly Delaware and Philadelphia. They resettled in the hills. They initially settled in western Pennsylvania, and they were constantly pushing against Native Americans in those regions, the Delaware Indians, for example. Only later, by the 1736, are they attracted to Virginia, where Virginians saw them as a similar buffer against Indians. So the earliest settlers come to the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia, but many more settle in the hills and uplands. And do I have an image of the hills and uplands? I don't. Okay. So these are the people who settle in the hills of Western Virginia. Now, a flip side of the large plantations in the South was that the best land was very expensive in the South. The so-called Black Belt, in the blackest soil, was in the sort of valleys. But the hill land is very, very, very cheap, almost free. And so many of the Scots-Irish settle in these hills. These presbyteries are associated with new religious traditions that are going to rack the colonies. What we see are revivalism in religious traditions. We see shouting, people shouting in church. The First Great Awakening, people crying out in sermons. Gilbert Tennant is one of the revivalist Presbyterian clerics. He forms a school that's very strong in theology and biblical exegesis, but he above all advocated enthusiasm. Tennant refuses to accept the authority of the presbytery. He exalts in having converts who are Negroes and Indians, that's his quote, and his strongest support was in the lower end of the state among those with the least property. And so much of the kind of religious revivalism, this New Light revivalism, is coming from these new Scots-Irish folks who are driven to the New World by the financial revolution. Okay. That's and then finally, we talked about it. The financial revolution of the British Empire brought Scots-Irish and Palatine settlers over to act as temporary servants for the small number of English settlers who were already there. This excellent increase in population will make it easier to hold off Spanish and French attempts to encroach on the Ohio and the Mississippi Valley. French and Spanish settlements in the Americas remains relatively small, but once the credit is available to move people, the richness of the soil and the declining power of the Iroquois, the Yamasee, and other Western Indians means that natural increase will make the colonies a hybrid of many societies, but still recognizably a part of the British Empire. Sorry about the empty ships. No, I mean, if you think about it, you want, if you're a ship merchant, you want to be selling things on both sides, in both directions, all right? So you're bringing the flax over from Newcastle, Delaware, or from Philadelphia to Northern Ireland. You don't want to send the ship back empty, but you have to keep every year bringing over more flax. And so you're willing to lower the price to fill the ship, right? And so that's why the price is so low. You want to fill the ship on the route from the east to the west. Does that make more sense? Okay. That said, so this is the Irish and Palatine migrations. That said, the African migration is the largest. They brought, by the boom in the slave trade in the 1700s, are key to this prosperity. And it's Britain in the 1700s that becomes a much more powerful player because of the financial revolution in the slave trade. They replace the Dutch, they replace the Spanish, they replace the French, all of whom are competing for the slave trade. The British become the most powerful slave traders in the 1700s. Enslaved Africans are largely key to the prosperity of the Americas. Virginia tobacco and Carolina rice are the major international exports of the New World in the period before the Revolution. Other drugs from the British Caribbean are the most essential. Jamaican sugar, Jamaican coffee, Trinidadian cocoa. Those are the most valuable to Britain, and South Carolina rice that feeds those enslaved people in the Caribbean is crucial. So to conclude, the grimmest feature of the financial revolution in Britain was a massive increase in the British slave trade. Between 1660, the overall British, in the decade before 1660, the overall British import of Africans was 24,000, which was smaller than the British and smaller than the Spanish and the Brazilian slave trade. By the 1690s, the yearly import is over 5 times that. Over 110,000 enslaved Africans per decade are brought over by the British. It greatly exceeds the French, the Dutch, and the Spanish. The mainland is relatively small, but these African descendants on the food-rich plantations of the American mainland will have children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren who will vastly outnumber them. But while the Scots and the Palatines will be able to farm on their own in 10 years, often by squatting on vacant land, African migrant descendants will not have their own land for 9 generations. If you were a temporary entry on the budget of a ship in the English financial revolution, your children would stand to do better on your grandchildren. If you made a permanent entry on English balance sheets, you will be one of the most important working assets for the empire, and it's likely your grandchildren's grandchildren will not own the land they work on. Okay, for the test, you've got 24 hours to do it, but I ask that you only take about an hour to write it. Okay, obviously I can't enforce that, but I'll post the test at 11:10 on Tuesday, and it'll be due 11:10, and it'll be due 24 hours from now. So it's not that African slaves preferred to stay in the South, it's that the people, Southerners had more capital and wealth because they're producing these valuable commodities, and they were able to buy more enslaved people. Slavery was all over the British New World, but it was much more concentrated in the American South because that's where all the money was. I'll give you a choice of questions, probably, but there'll be just one question to answer.